The defection of the Third Estate, and their subsequent unilateral declaration of a National Assembly on June 17, 1789, sent shockwaves through the halls of Versailles. Many hardcore monarchists wanted the defectors arrested and made to recant. Director General Jean-Jacques Necker even went so far as to suggest that the Château de Versailles, where the assembly met, should be demolished, with the delegates inside. Louis, by contrast, dismissed the National Assembly as a mere change of name. This would all soon blow over. His actions of the 17th, however, betrayed his true feelings. Until late in the night, Louis received counsel from both Necker and Barentin, who offered divergent opinions on how best to proceed. The Director General, for instance, proposed calling a Séance Royale, and compelling, by lit de justice, the remainder of the First and Second Estates to join the National Assembly. It would be admitting defeat, yes, but would salvage something of the situation by allowing deliberations to continue, albeit on the Assembly's terms. Barentin vociferously disagreed. As the former Advocate General attached to the Paris Parlement, Barentin was well versed in the minutiae of the mezzanine French legal system, and Louis' Keeper of the Seals saw immediately that the National Assembly's adoption of a representative function would soon lead to their assumption of a legislative mantle. This fact would not be lost upon the lawyers and jurists of the Assembly. And by arcane legal wizardry and a bit of concerted brainpower, they could likely do all of this legally. Such madness had to be stopped, else the National Assembly start dictating law, not merely judging those put forth by the Crown. The National Assembly, therefore, represented an immediate threat to the legitimacy of the Crown, already reeling after the myriad failures of the recent past. In the main, a majority of the Assembly's 580 delegates were committed to spearheading an enlightened liberal agenda, functioning in concert with the pre-existing royal ministry. That being said, it would be unconstrained by protocol or royal decree, beholden instead to the people first and foremost. The Assembly's legitimacy was derived from its popular support from among the commons, an expression of the general will of the French people. Indeed, the formation of the National Assembly garnered a rapturous fanfare from among the lower orders, signalling that they now had at least some say in affairs of state. For this reason, the Assembly viewed itself as indispensable to the proper functioning of the kingdom going forward, representative of a compromise between the king and his subjects, even if the king was not yet fully on board. For the first time in French history, the Third Estate was something more than just a faceless, listless mob with abstract demands and no representation, ignorable and ignorant. Though far from ideal, the National Assembly was a crucial advance in the history of modern democracy. One of the Assembly's first moves was to invite members of the First and Second Estates to join up with them. Feelers had been sent out as early as June 13th, snagging some liberal clergymen. Well, momentum was with the Assembly, and they received reports that yet more nobles and clergymen were open to defecting. Thus, the Assembly voted on whether or not to allow other estates to join. The proposal carried, 483 in favour, 41 against. The first rounds of defectors came from the First Estate, where division and disagreement ran deep. Liberally minded parish priests and lay clergy, fed up with the venal corruption of their higher-ups, and believers in the Assembly's representative project, held a distinctly separatist sentiment. Seeing the chance to jump ship, 3 joined on the 13th, and over the next few days, several more defected for a total of 18. Still, the overwhelming majority of the First Estate remained in staunch opposition to the new National Assembly, apoplectic at dissent within their ranks. And yet, despite the robed clergy's consternation, over the coming weeks, more and more of the low-ranking priests were siphoned off by the Assembly. The Second Estate had this same problem, just to a lesser degree. A good number of liberal nobles peeled off to join the National Assembly, men like the Marquis de Lafayette. But the majority remained firmly in place, where they railed against what was perceived as borderline insurrection against the king. It was members of the Second Estate who used their influence to advocate for a zero-tolerance policy towards the Assembly, as embodied in Barentin's proposal. So, the newly created National Assembly was a cumbersome beast, being born, as it was, of an unlikely set of alliances. Its founders, and largest constituency, were the politically awakened bourgeoisie and intelligentsia, whose main goals were to pursue national political reform and ensure their own rights. Liberal nobles formed the next largest contingent. Naturally, many were there to protect their own interests, but many were ardent liberals, genuinely invested in bringing about enlightened reforms. And of course, the clergy made up the rest of the delegates, sympathetic as they were to reform and redress. Now, just as a quick aside, I'd like to introduce 3 more nobles. Yeah, more nobles, I know, but believe me, these guys are important. Less so for the revolution perhaps, but certainly for the history of France, because, spoiler alert, 2 of these guys will become kings of France, and the other will meet his end during the Reign of Terror. I am of course referring to King Louis's brothers, the Comte de Provence and the Comte d'Artois, as well as the Duc d'Orléans, patriarch of the Orléans sub-branch of the Bourbon royal dynasty and the Prince of the Blood. So we'll go in order. First up, the Comte de Provence. Louis Stanislas Xavier was born in 1755, the year after his elder brother, our boy Louis Auguste. Now the presumptive heir to the throne was Louis Ferdinand, son to King Louis XV and the father to our 3 brothers. But as we know, Louis Ferdinand died. Now I didn't mention this, but really probably should have, but succession didn't actually pass directly to Louis Auguste, but rather to the eldest of the brothers, Louis Joseph. Louis Joseph was favoured as heir, and given a proper kingly education. A wasted education as it turned out, because he died young, the royal heir apparent then becoming Louis Auguste. This is why Louis's education was so stunted from a young age. He was not the favoured candidate for king, and so not given the full royal education from a young age. By contrast, Louis Xavier was given a proper education, likely in hopes that he might one day be king. Certainly, he was a better candidate than his older brother. Temperamentally, Louis Xavier was much more driven, much more confident. He took to his schooling with vigour, excelling in all areas. As Louis Xavier matured, becoming the Comte de Provence, he chafed as the second son of the Bourbons. But this did not stop the Comte from seeking political power and influence. Power and influence that Louis Auguste, now King Louis XVI, deliberately denied to his little brother. Locked out of the royal ministry, Louis Xavier toured France, developing a far more comprehensive view of the kingdom than pretty well anyone else in his family. As Louis was undergoing the trials and tribulations of his early reign, life for the Comte was fairly benign. He married a Savoyard princess and lived the recumbent life of an indescribably wealthy young aristocrat. Yet he was still resentful of his elder brother. He held out hope for one day succeeding to the throne, but that hope was dashed by the birth of Louis Joseph, that little lad who we know died only days before the tennis court oath. Well, this development was the death blow for the Comte de Provence's aspirations. So he spent his days reading, resigned to his lot in life. But by the late 1780s, when Louis XVI's reign was looking very shaky, as the economic crisis wrought terrible consequences, the Comte was presented with an opportunity to revive, or more accurately, begin his political career. As a brother of the king, the Comte was called to attend the Assembly of Notables, wherein he refused to compromise with Cologne and then later Brienne. In the subsequent Estates General, the Comte was again called to attend, and there he supported many of the more major concessions made to the Third Estate. Namely, he was all for double representation. It's fair to say that this was a move made out of spite for Louis, rather than any deep-seated liberal convictions. Indeed, while the Comte was a very well-read man, and could access any number of Enlightenment texts forbidden to the general public, he was not moved to adopt a liberal mantle. His political manoeuvrings were entirely selfish. He wanted to be king. The Comte d'Artois, by contrast, was loyal to his elder brother. Bon Charles Philippe, a name that harkened back to French kings of old, and a name that made later historians very happy, with one less Louis to remember. As youngest of the brothers, Charles was unlikely to become king, and so was often overlooked. Most of his adolescence was pretty bog-standard for a wealthy aristocrat. He had a fine education, lived in sumptuous comfort, and had not a care in the world. This fairly loose life saw Charles become quite a gregarious, if often naive young man, prone to gambling and affairs. Like the Comte de Provence, the Comte d'Artois married an eligible Savoyard princess. And that was that. He was never going to become king, barring some terrible set of circumstances, like perhaps a revolution. Well, what do you know, but a revolution came the kingdom's way. Charles was to make his first contribution by supporting reforms that would compel taxation of the nobility. But that was as far as he was willing to go. As far as he would ever go, really. In every other regard, the Comte was super conservative, an ultra-royalist, you might say. It was often Charles who, in private, counselled Louis away from compromise, pushing him towards a hard line. So I think you can guess that the Comte was not a fan of the new National Assembly. In protest to their formation, he and his family fled the country on the night of the 17th, beginning a life in exile that would last until the Bourbon Restoration in 1814. That being said, the Comte de Provence will not sit idly by. He was a schemer, and a wealthy one at that. From now on, behind the scenes, the Comte will be plotting to undermine the revolution and bolster the Bourbons. And this brings us to the Duc d'Orléans. Unlike the brothers, he will play an active role in the revolution, just from the opposing side. Louis-Philippe was born in 1747, the heir for the Orléans family, the Orléans being the senior cadet branch for the extended Bourbon royal family. So basically, if something happened to the Bourbons, the Orléans would probably take over. To simplify things, just remember that the Duke is the cousin of Louis XVI. Like all wealthy aristocrats, he was given a fine education and then married off as soon as possible. Marriage, however, was not to Louis-Philippe's liking. He was a well-known libertine and had nearly as many affairs as he did creditors. Things only get interesting when Louis-Philippe joined the Navy right in time to be made a squadron leader for the American War of Independence. Unfortunately for France, he was a piss-poor captain, and after fumbling at the Battle of Ushant, retired in disgrace. Languishing in isolation from his aristocratic colleagues and out of favour at court, Louis-Philippe turned to reading, making a ready convert to the sweeping changes proposed by Enlightenment philosophers and writers. And like so many of our liberals, he was an avowed Rousseauist. Louis-Philippe becoming such a strident liberal was quite a boon for other liberals in the lead-up to the revolution. He funded a number of clubs and salons, later opening up the Orléans' traditional Paris residence, the Palais Royal, to the public. This was a momentous move. If Paris was the epicenter of liberalism and the Enlightenment in France, then the Palais Royal was the epicenter of liberalism and the Enlightenment in Paris. Liberal political leanings isolated Louis-Philippe yet further from his aristocratic peers, but that was fine by him. He found new friends amongst the liberal intelligentsia, yes, but also support from among the people. With poverty rife, Louis-Philippe's philanthropic works ingratiated him mightily to the common people. Now, he was not yet the Duc d'Orléans at this time. He became the Duke in 1785 after the death of his father, inheriting not just his titles but his lands too. As such a powerful liberal figure and major landowner, it was only fitting that the new Duc d'Orléans be sent to the Estates General. There, he was among the handful, and I do mean handful, maybe 5 or 6 guys amongst a cohort of nearly 300, that pushed hard for reform, both political and economic. And it is here that the Duke remains for now. So to get our story back on track, unfortunately for the delegates to the National Assembly, the optimistic outlook of their formation was belied by the realities of conservative backlash. On the morning of June 18th, the various members of the National Assembly proceeded down the Rue de Paris towards the Château de Versailles, just as they had done for several weeks now. But this morning was to prove different than all the rest. Soldiers had blocked the way and barred the door. Ostensibly, it was to allow workers into the hall for scheduled repairs. The real reason was lost on nobody. As a precautionary measure, the Royal Ministry had ordered that the National Assembly be prevented from meeting until Versailles dictated a course of action. As it was, Louis was still vacillating between the proposals of Barentin and Necker. At least on the surface, Louis seemed to concur with Necker, but in private didn't know where he stood. At the council meeting on the 19th, held in Versailles' Château de Marly, the king heard the various objections to the Séance Royale put forth by Necker's detractors. Deliberations would likely have continued to the 20th, but Necker was delayed. Believing that the king was likely coming around to Barentin's position of zero tolerance, Necker hastily issued a letter to Louis recommending not a Séance Royale, but a sort of sit-down between the various estates to hash out a compromise. But by the time the letter reached the king, preparations for the Séance Royale were already underway. It was scheduled for the 22nd. In the meantime, the National Assembly was still prevented from, assembling, and so the various delegates and parties had dispersed to form their own impromptu assemblies. Most congregated in a large hall, a few buildings down from the chateau. Perhaps in part because they were dispersed, and perhaps also in part due to deliberate malfeasance, word of the Séance Royale never reached the National Assembly. For reasons beyond comprehension, official notice was delivered with posters. These posters plastered on walls and message boards throughout Versailles. No official messengers were dispatched. Was this a product of Barentin's spite? Maybe the work of reactionary nobles, who refused to legitimize the National Assembly by acknowledging them through official channels. Who knows? This lack of communication, however, contributed mightily to a growing fear among the Assembly that a crackdown was imminent. The Breton delegation, for instance, thought that the police would soon arrive and round them all up. To make such a move costly, they passed a proposal unilaterally declaring that all taxes were illegal, until reviewed by the Assembly, though those taxes would continue to be paid in the meantime. Such an unprecedented and drastic move was to be outdone within the day. Though the Château de Versailles was still inaccessible, the National Assembly could meet elsewhere. At the insistence of Delegate Joseph Ignace de Guillotine, that guillotine, the Assembly reconvened at an indoor tennis court. Outside, crowds of onlookers gawked at the delegates as they entered the building, their cheers and cries filling the air. Never designed for such numbers, the tennis court was standing room only, and stiflingly hot. Despite the discomfort, they got straight down to business. Most of the delegates agreed that the king's actions were unjust. As far as the Assembly was concerned, between his abuses of power and dismissal of valid concerns about reform, Louis had burned a lot of bridges. Yet, this disillusionment with Louis did not generate disloyalty. Far from it, in fact. All in the Assembly were quick to reaffirm their genuine, unwavering fealty to the king. But even loyalty had its limits. Going forward, the best way to ensure that the king enjoyed the confidence of his subjects was to implement a constitution that clearly marked the limits of royal power. At the mere suggestion of a constitution, most conservatives, already very shaky about this whole National Assembly thing, tried to pump the brakes. These members called for the National Assembly to withdraw to Paris for safety. But the Liberal majority weren't having it. They would stand firm and officially petition the king to plead their case. Thus, despite the repressive measures being weighed up in Versailles, the National Assembly had no intention of openly defying the king. Such a thought was sacrilege, even at this stage. As far as they saw it, they were going to avert disaster, save the king and the kingdom. What nobler expression of loyalty could there be? And yet, as the hours ticked by with no official word from the royal ministry, it was hard to feel optimistic about their liberal project. The Roman police crackdown could be imminent. Lettres de cachet might already be on the way. The National Assembly's fate seemed to hang in the balance. In such a charged atmosphere, abuzz with the clamour of discussion and debate, attention turned to methods of survival. A mild voice cut through the din. That of Secretary Jean-Joseph Meunier. A professed monarchist and constitutionalist, young Meunier had his origins as a profoundly capable jurist, later becoming magistrate for Grenoble in 1783. Inspired by the works of René Descartes, Meunier railed against the excesses of a Bourbon government, which he believed no longer acted with the people's best interests at heart. All of this he espoused in his seminal work, Considérations sur le gouvernement, a tome which argued for reform but insisted upon retaining the sanctity of traditional roles, like that of the king and the nobility. But even these fairly innocuous aims placed Meunier firmly in the liberal camp, He readily took to this role, and Meunier achieved much aplomb in his native Dauphine as an outspoken liberal figure. As you might recall, he was the guy who came up with double representation in July 1788 for the purposes of an Estates Provincial. Meunier was one among many who insisted that the Estates General be called in response to crises like the Day of Tiles. Upon the formation of the National Assembly, Meunier had been made Secretary of the Assembly, a role which suited his methodical, lawyerly disposition. It was Meunier who was the principal writer for the Assembly's Cahiers de doléances, the letters of grievance sent to the king. Meunier stamped his mark on the budding revolution on the 19th. He made an address, in which he reminded all of the importance of a constitution. No other aim could come before drafting such a document. To that end, Meunier proposed that all delegates swear an oath binding them to this objective, that their work would only be complete when France had a constitution. For his bold announcement, Meunier was applauded by his peers. A lawyer named Guy Jean-Baptiste Talget got to work drafting the text of the oath. This is what he ended up with. Considering that the National Assembly has been called to establish the constitution of the realm, to bring about the regeneration of public order, and to maintain the true principles of monarchy, nothing may prevent it from continuing its deliberations in any place it is forced to establish itself. And finally, the National Assembly exists wherever its members are gathered. It is decreed that all members of this assembly immediately take a solemn oath never to separate, and to reassemble wherever circumstances require until the constitution of the realm is consolidated on firm foundations. And that said, oath having been sworn, all members and each one individually confirms this unwavering resolution with his signature. We swear never to separate ourselves from the National Assembly, and to reassemble wherever circumstances require until the constitution of the realm is drawn up and fixed upon solid foundations. The hands of the delegates raised in salutes and waves were then turned to the signing of their names to Talget's document. 576 of the Assembly's members, all but one, put their names to the oath. United in aim and principle, the delegates got to work. The king and his ministers had been far from enthralled with the formation of the National Assembly, but the public adoption of a constitutional mantle was a bridge too far, an affront to the majesty of the king and an assault upon traditional feudal order. It was not lost upon any of Louis's allies or ministers that such a constitution would neuter royal prerogatives and officially demote the king. Amidst calls for dispersing the assembly by force or arresting its members, Louis stuck to his guns and insisted that the matter come to a head at the Séance Royale. Necker, having caught wind that his conciliatory position had been rejected entirely, delayed attending the séance until it was untenably late to go. He knew that the king would have the National Assembly subjected to every insult and humiliation imaginable to show them their proper place. It was a recipe for disaster. Necker's overly optimistic round table undermined by Barentin's hard line. As the National Assembly shuffled down the Rue Chantier to the séance, they found the doors closed shut. In a chilly downpour, they waited until finally Deputy Bailly's knocks at the door were answered. In short order, the assembly was told that they had arrived too early, and the door was again slammed shut. So the assembly waited, and waited, and waited. Again, a few hours passed until they were finally admitted into a small antechamber. Eventually, flanked by royal guards, the delegates were led through to the main hall, joining the First and Second Estates. Soon afterwards, the king and the royal procession arrived, escorted by household cavalry, heralded by trumpets and fanfare. Not a peep was heard from the crowds outside as Louis entered the grounds. Still, he did receive warm adoration when he entered the hall from the First and Second Estates, who fell over themselves to deliver conspicuous displays of deference and loyalty. As the king made his way around the hall, meeting various important nobles, bishops and leaders, the National Assembly was deliberately snubbed. Left to last, and given only a perfunctory introduction, they gave Louis no cheers, instead maintaining a contemptuous silence. King Louis XVI opened the Séance Royale in his dull, monotone voice, with a short but direct speech that emphasised his aversion to social change, and opposition to the National Assembly's June 17th declarations that they were the only legitimate authority in France. He was followed by Barentin, who rattled off the rules of the séance. Then came the carrot and the stick. First, the stick. Louis abhorred the National Assembly's unilateral declarations and annulled all of their decisions thus far. The king was not going to be constrained by a constitution, and all attempts made to such an end were forbidden. Furthermore, the rights and privileges enjoyed by the clergy and nobility would remain in place. Once all of the recriminations were out of the way, Barentin offered the National Assembly the carrot, the various concessions the Crown was willing to make. These included the relaxing of censorship, the establishment of a free press, and the abolition of the dreaded lettre de cachet. Then there were two major concessions. Firstly, the establishment of a provincial Estates General, music to the ears of the delegates who would have such a say in these bodies, and secondly, oversight on ministerial budgets, and input into the form and adoption of taxes. For such significant concessions, however, there was a cost. Barentin made it clear that each was contingent upon all of the estates, by which he meant the National Assembly, agreeing to Necker's economic reform package. In excruciating detail, he then read out each and every one of the 35 points of the package. After Barentin was finished, Louis returned to the podium to end the first day of the séance. In his closing remarks, he reiterated his divinely ordained authority and the sanctity of the Ancien Régime. He also made it very clear to the National Assembly that the First and Second Estates had powers of veto over any and all of their proposals. Thus, the unilateral lawmaking was not going to fly. And with that, Louis left. Not long after, the First and Second Estates began to file out as well. They left the séance completely down for getting reforms passed, albeit with minor modifications. No surprise, really. Both orders had been thoroughly flattered in the days prior, their indispensability to the Crown made abundantly clear. Not so for the National Assembly. It was 6 weeks too late for any concessions, much less flattery, to make any difference for the National Assembly. Economic reform could only come after the constitutional question was answered. This was the necessary precondition to the Assembly's cooperation going forward. So when the séance drew to a close, and the First and Second Estates began to file out, the National Assembly, quite rightly, felt as though there was more to say. A constitution had to be discussed, its necessity clearly established. The séance was not at an end until the National Assembly could say its piece. When given orders to disperse by the Master of Ceremonies, they refused in contemptuous defiance. Not long after, soldiers prodded at the delegates with their bayonets, trying to corral them out of the building. Most would not budge. Others hastened out the door on the business end of a bayonet. At this crucial moment, the inestimable Comte de Mirabeau rallied them all, and in his booming voice reminded them of their oaths. The gathered delegates reaffirmed their oaths right then and there in the hall, much to the consternation of the remaining nobles and clergymen. From here, things escalated quickly. A royal bailiff was summoned, and he attempted to disperse the assembly. But the commanding presence of Mirabeau, backed by Bailly, Lafayette, Sieyes, Grégoire, Talleyrand, and many others, was enough to keep the bailiff at bay. Mirabeau declared that the assembly was there by the will of the French people, and that all orders to disperse were null and void unless delivered by the people, not by the king. He ended his triumphant speech with a final, defiant declaration. The assembled nation cannot be given orders. Louis's reaction to the intransigence of the National Assembly is difficult to pin down. By some accounts, he is reported to have ordered them to be removed by force. In other reports, he came to terms with it very quickly, remarking, "Well, so be it, let them stay." But no matter how he reacted, King Louis was certainly feeling the weight of his crown upon his head more keenly than ever, power slipping through his fingers as though it was sand. Mob violence by now had erupted in Paris and Versailles, instigated by rumours that the popular Necker was absent because he'd been fired. Soldiers and government officials were openly attacked in the streets, and buildings were ransacked. A mob of several thousand began to form outside the palace, in full view of the royal family. As it was, Necker was considering resigning his post. Before he could make a decision, however, Necker was summoned to Versailles to answer for his whereabouts on the 22nd. He found himself set squarely in the king's sights, blamed for the abject failure of the Séance Royale. Harking back to his temper of old, Louis raged at his Director General. "It is I, monsieur, who is making all the sacrifices, making them with all my heart, whilst you take all the credit. You want to take all the thanks yourself." Even in spite of his dressing down, Louis convinced Necker not to resign. The king knew all too well that until the economic reform package was made law, the Director General was indispensable to the crown. Ever the self-publicist, Necker took to the crowd to allay their fear that he was being forced out of the Conseil de Roy. Nonetheless, the mob did not disperse, and so troops were ordered to force the issue. The troops, however, declined their orders and remained in barracks. Hoping to avoid another flower war-type revolt, Louis had Minister for War de Broglie dispatch the Swiss Rheinarch regiment for garrison duty in Paris. Other regiments received similar orders. A bad day for Louis grew even worse. In defiance of their king, 47 members of the nobility, led by his cousin, the liberal noble the Duc d'Orléans, and some holdout clergy, joined with the National Assembly, citing their opposition to royal absolutism. As the days rolled by, the royal ministry found its support among the clergy and nobility rapidly decaying. So, popular support evaporated, the loyalty of the troops in question, and an incoherent strategy from on high. Louis bowed to the inevitable. Reversing course and a complete U-turn, Louis gave in on the 25th by permitting sympathetic nobles and clergymen to freely join the National Assembly. This was official recognition of the ascendancy of the National Assembly. And whether or not Louis knew it at the time, it was also effectively the begrudging approval of the proposed constitution. For all intents and purposes, the French Revolution had begun, and the first of many watershed moments had come and gone in a rapid-fire succession of meetings, debates, speeches, and stare-offs. The royal monopoly on power had been shattered. Power would now have to be shared with a body that, at least superficially, aligned more with the general will of the people, more so than the preservation of the ancien regime. That's not to say that we have a National Assembly comprised of professional revolutionaries aching to enshrine into law a truly liberal constitution. A vast majority were still self-serving, egotistical, and avaricious, wanting a constitution that replaced the ancien regime with a political and economic structure that benefited them more than it had before. Their proposed constitution would give people personal liberty, but no actual freedom or say in politics. And certainly, it wouldn't invite any kind of social upheaval. But at the least, a majority of delegates were genuinely politicized and enlightened, sympathetic, if not outright supportive, of the people. They did not intend to betray the trust of the Frenchmen who now proudly declared their loyalty to the National Assembly in the streets of France's cities. These men wanted a liberal constitution and guaranteed rights for all Frenchmen. They wanted free markets and free trade. They wanted rationality and talent to guide the process of government. They wanted to implement the radical economic reforms for which the kingdom chafed. But when it all came down to it, the concept of a constitution and the desire to rid France of feudalism were the only unifying traits for the National Assembly, and beyond that, any real connection or idealism broke down in the face of irreconcilable ideological and personal differences. The National Assembly, born of such auspicious democratic and revolutionary tidings, was to prove as dysfunctional and out of touch as the king and his ministers. As pen was put to paper on the preliminary drafts of the Constitution, fierce debates, perhaps the fiercest thus far seen, raged in the halls, salons, and coffee houses of France. And yet, herein lies the problem. Politics. Every one of our movers and shakers in these heady, early days of the revolution, had the luxury of talking politics. They aren't staring down the barrel of bankruptcy caused by rapid inflation or stagnant wages. They aren't trembling in the cold, their fireplaces unlit, unable to afford firewood. They aren't wasting away from hunger, from sickness, from the cumulative effects of years of poverty. Our nobles, liberals, lawyers, priests and professionals have the luxury of talking politics because time is on their side. The economic issues that ailed the peasantry sidelined to answer questions of a constitutional nature. Though we know what's in store for France, nobody at the time was any the wiser. And yet, as the days ticked by, the economic questions unanswered, those issues would not abate. They will instead be exacerbated by the political fallout of the tennis court oath, the pressure growing. As the National Assembly and the Royal Ministry were fumbling with matches, they were sitting atop a powder keg about ready to explode.